Today's discussion will be presented in 3 sections since we are recording it for a radio broadcast on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. You're welcome to post questions and comments during the session and we'll try to answer them online. I'd like to introduce our moderator, Jason Miller, Executive Editor of Federal News Radio.
Welcome to the discussion. My guests today are Frank Konecki, the Chief Technology Officer at the Air Force, Phil Klokas, the Associate Chief Information Officer of the Public Building Service at the General Services Administration, Dr. Michael Valavola, the Chief Technology Officer for the National Agriculture Statistics Service at the Department of Agriculture, and Bob Osborne, the Chief Technology Officer for Federal at ServiceNow. Gentlemen, welcome to the discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Before we get started, let me set a little bit of context for our discussion today. Just 3 years ago, a Brookings Institution review of agency strategic plans found not one mention of Internet of Things. Now the Internet of Things is changing the computing landscape across the government, from mobile and wearable devices to smart sensors in buildings to drones sending back a volume and veracity of data that we've never seen before. Almost everything is getting an IP address these days. From GSA's use of sensors to manage costs of heating and cooling buildings, to USDA's efforts to more accurately gauge farm production, the government's use of connected devices is skyrocketing. In fact, the growth of connected devices is happening around the world. The McKinsey Global Institute estimates 25 to 50 billion devices will be connected to the internet by 2025 across the globe. And as agencies wade deeper into IT modernization efforts, these connected devices will play a larger role in how they transform service delivery and meet mission goals. Despite the excitement and promise of IoT devices, there's still a lot of questions: security, interoperability, discovering the value of data. All are part of the policy and procedure discussions going on across government. In fact, Senator Mark Warner is so concerned about IoT security, for example, he introduced the Internet of Things Cybersecurity Improvement Act last December. The bill would require agencies to buy IoT devices that meet a minimum level of security standards. So what does the broader use of connected devices mean for agencies, particularly as they move more and more applications to the cloud? How do IoT devices change your approach to acquisition, security, data analytics? What are the policy questions that you still need to address? Well, that's why we have our panel here today. They're going to address these complex challenges as agencies are laying the groundwork to deal with this explosion of connected devices that is here today and only getting bigger. Frank, I'm going to start with you. You and I had a wonderful conversation a few months back on this specific topic, IoT, and you guys at the Air Force are doing a ton of great work. So let's just start with IoT, AI, machine learning, fill in the emerging technology blank. Where does this fit into the overall Air Force's kind of strategy?
Well, the strategy, of course, is to actually use data, and actually use data effectively. I mean, this is where we're getting to. We established a CDO office to support getting authoritative data and how you're going to use authoritative data. We also have an AI cell developing that's going to look at how you use AI across the Air Force now, especially since DoD announced the JAC. That just came out last week, I believe.
The JAC, of course, is the
Joint AI Center. Yes.
Thank you. Just in case we don't get lost in your acronyms, right?
We'll try to keep them down.
That's fine.
And so we're looking at lots of things right now. So as we do IoT devices, we have a lot of devices, for instance, in trucks, in airplanes, in engines, everything else across the board. And the first question is, how are you going to use all this information? Some of that is with AI related, such as engine maintenance activities, and how we're going to maintain the engines and look at what spare parts we need to pre-position based upon engine wear. There's other activities too with the smart cities. And one of the infrastructure things we're actually doing right now is to make sure that we actually have LTE coverage on the bases. Because it's really cool to have a lot of IoT devices linking to the internet, but there's no internet connectivity. So one of the initiatives we have right now is to push LTE across all the bases. And as we progress, we're pushing out right now a request for licensing authority and everything else for at least start of the bases, at least a section of the country right now, and we're going to do the rest of the country.
So I know there's a lot to talk about the bases, but let me just ask one other question about the LTE piece and how that relates more broadly to the infrastructure. At the same time, you have all these devices and all this data, you also need the infrastructure behind it. So is that also part of the strategy?
Part of the strategy is looking at what cloud capabilities we have to have. We're also looking at a strategy of as we take the information, do we actually download all the information, or do we actually work on that information based where it comes in? Especially when you talk about it at the airplane level. Because you can't keep sending all the information down. You have to be able to process information and send the key information back down. And so we're looking at what infrastructure support do we have, and a lot of it depends upon how miniaturization the processor and storage are getting, how fast can they actually operate. Because in certain aircraft we have minimum amounts of space and electricity to actually manage that. So you have to think of it as everything gets more miniature and more small and more equipped and faster. We're actually going to be using it more to do the processing and get more key IoT information back down to the field.
All right. Let me turn to Bob now, just based on what you heard from Frank, and I'm sure we'll hear from the rest. Give me a sense from ServiceNow, seeing from its clients, from the people you're working with in the government.
Well, Jason, this is an exciting time to be a technologist, particularly in the government, because we're seeing disruptive technologies change how we do business in our personal lives, right? So we've got artificial intelligence, intelligent agents helping us make decisions in virtually every aspect of our personal lives. And this type of technological revolution is now making incursions into the workplace. So the enterprise IT solutioning has to be radically different going forward than what we're used to. You spoke about IoT, and that's exploding across the world, and it's impacting federal governments and really all highly regulated industries by causing us to look at how we define the borders of our enterprise really differently. So you have an internal and external view to any enterprise, and those boundaries are now going to be blurred by the introduction of wearables and implantable devices that we don't have control of removing very easily or sensibly in our environment. So how we construct from an enterprise architecture view, how we have a security posture that allows us to be aware of what devices are requesting access to our various networks, how we grant those accesses, roles-based permissions, et cetera. Those types of things have to be really redefined in this new era of connectivity. Frank talked about the ability to provide wireless connectivity across all the bases in the Air Force. That's across the world in general, but particularly government agencies. When we move from commercial provided internet connectivity into federally provided internet connectivity, the rules change, of course. There's much more security and regulation over that. And yet the devices that we're carrying and introducing into those enterprises are exactly the same. So how do we deal with that? And what are going to be the policies around that? But more importantly, how do we architect re-engineering the IT foundations that are providing the services internally to our employees in the various agencies, and then externally to the citizen consumers of agency services as we move forward.
So you mentioned one of my favorite topics, enterprise architecture, so maybe that's for a later discussion. But let me turn to Phil real quick. Now, Phil, we're excited to have you because, number one, the Public Building Service is doing so much great work. It's one of those places that I think the unknown success stories across government. So maybe talk a little bit about what you guys are doing at PBS around this use of IoT sensors and the infrastructure piece, as Bob and Frank have talked about.
Sure. And Frank mentioned about the airplanes, right? So I'm the building guy, right? Because our buildings are talking to us now with a lot of the sensors and a lot of the controls that we have in place. So really, we feel that we have to modernize our infrastructure, and we're doing that in three major areas. And again, Frank mentioned about the data and the use of the data. So we have a platform called our D2D environment, Data to Decisions. So it's a cloud-based platform that we're collecting a series of data points from not only our buildings, but from our business lines, whether that's financial information or portfolio information about our inventory or sensored information that the IoT and our smart buildings are providing. And there's a massive amount of data that we're collecting. So we need to be able to have the capability or an infrastructure to support and collect the information. And once you collect it, you need to store the information. Then you need to normalize the information, right? Make sure you're comparing apples to apples and model the data so you can turn that data into useful information. And then above all, you need to analyze and wrap analytics around that data. And ultimately, you want to act on that data, because that's what it's all about, right? You can have all the data in the world, you can have all the information in the world, but we need to figure out how to turn that data into information that we can act on and make informed business decisions. The second thing we're doing, Jason, is to look at our infrastructure. You mentioned about the cloud. It's not going to go away, right? I mean, a matter of fact, a lot of agencies, we as well, cloud-first environment, we're moving in that direction. But we also have our wide area network that we support within the GSA infrastructure, and we're looking to make that more robust, because you can imagine the amount of information that not only we're collecting, but the devices that are going to be in our buildings and that are in our buildings. How do we make our network robust enough to handle that data traffic, not only now, but in the future? And so we're looking to leverage some of the enterprise contracts that are in place. Our sister organization, the Federal Acquisition Service, put together a contract called the Enterprise Infrastructure Services, the EIS contract. We're really excited about that. We're looking to take advantage of some of the features and some of the technologies that are part of that contract. At the Public Building Service, we have 1,500 owned assets, owned buildings that we have, right? And we have about 70% of those are connected to the GSA wide area network. And in many cases, these are connected with what we call a point-to-point connection, or a T1 connection, which nowadays it's 1.5 megabits of speed. It's almost a little better than dial-up, if you remember. I'm showing my age here, but a little better than dial-up capability, right? And that's not only to accommodate what our buildings are doing, right, and the information that we're pulling back and forth between our buildings, but business operations, financial operations, email traffic. So we're looking, what can we do to modernize that infrastructure? And we're doing that, quite frankly, with things like software-defined networking and other types of technology that are available on that EIS contract. And then last but certainly not least, I think we have to look at the people. Right? The technology is one thing. We can put the technology in place, but in order to have a successful infrastructure in place, you need to have the right people to not only manage it, but also to leverage the capabilities that the modernization and the emerging technologies that are going to afford us in the future.
I love the reference to the T1. I think Frank was laughed as well, because you probably have some bases with a few T1s, but remember when they were the big thing. Dr. Valavula, let's talk about USDA a little bit. You have a very similar challenge as Phil, with lots of places, disparity, but you have the harder probably job of the connection piece, right? Because people in the field. So talk a little about your strategy.
Correct, Jason. Just to set the context, and what we do at National Agricultural Statistics Service, we are the number keepers to the U.S. agriculture. We have been doing it for over 150 years. We collect all kinds of data. Anything that you want to know about U.S. agriculture, we have it. We do it very well. We publish over 450 reports every year. And also the trading places, the movie you have seen, those commodity trading places, those estimates that we publish, that, corn, soybean futures, and things of that nature, we publish those sensitive reports. And we have thousands of surveys that we conduct, and we collect data. You folks probably heard about precision agriculture. And this country has about 2.3 billion acres of total land mass. Of that, about 946 million acres is farmland. If you take the farmland, about 55% of the farmland is more of thousands of acres owned by a single person or an entity. So these folks, to reduce operational cost, they use lots of technology. You talk about autonomous vehicles. You see the driverless tractors tilling the land. And you have variable irrigators, they have sensors. Combines, they have sensors. They can estimate how much corn that's being harvested. So all these tools that are being used in the field today have sensors, and they collect all that information. And the problem that we have in a day-to-day issue is we have reduced number of responses coming back from our surveys. The only way we can get more data, better data, is to go to these entities or the sensors where the data is being collected and take the data from there instead of asking the farmers to provide that information. And the challenge that we have is, how do we collect the data from different sources, different producers, different formats, so all these go to different clouds, and so how are we going to integrate all these data elements that we have? We are talking about billions and billions or trillions and trillions bytes of data. So we are trying to move in that direction so that we don't have to ask the farmer for the same information. If it is already there, we can get it. We don't have to asked for it, that is reducing the respondent burden, which is very, very important for us. We want to make it easy for the farmers. And we are also looking at the possibility of developing analytical models. Like we publish this predictive data, that is the estimates, what the corn is going to be for this year or soybean this year. So those, we may be able to estimate that better with the analytical models that we are trying to develop. For example, predictive models. And we do have folks working in this direction, and we want to run like parallel studies, that you have a classical way of doing things and also doing it in a way that is more analytical, more automated, and we will have that running parallelly. But I'm talking about 5 to 10 years from now. It will take us that much time to integrate all these data elements and come to the point where we are confident that the methods that we are using, analytical models that we are using, are going to match what we are doing today. So that is what we are looking at in terms of IoT and analytics.
So it seems like you have two things going on. You have the long term, which is what could take 5 or 10 years, but also the short term need of understanding the data right away. So is there an infrastructure, let's talk just briefly about the infrastructure piece that you guys are looking at to balance out your short term needs.
We are looking at cloud, for example, like everybody else, and we are moving into the cloud little by little. And we have something called CIPSI, Confidential Information Protection Statistical Enhancement Act, that says that we will not reveal the information that we collect from the farmers. If we do, we will fine $250,000 or put in jail for 5 years. We have something called a lockup area, which is air gapped. We process this information, sensitive information, not touching the internet ever. So that is probably the last thing to go into the cloud. I do not see that is going into the public cloud. That may stay in a private cloud in-house. So that is very important for us to keep the privacy and the sensitivity of the data intact, and we cannot just sacrifice that, because if we do that, we won't be able to get any data, because we make that guarantee to our farmers and ranchers that will never ever be released to the public. The only data they will publish is the aggregate data at the county level and state level, and the estimates that we make as the national levels. That's what we do.
So it sounds like there's a balance that you guys have to do. I think Frank was shaking his head as that too. But let's take a quick break. When we come back, we can jump into a little more of the details. You're listening to the panel discussion, Capitalizing on the Next Wave of Technologies for Connected Government, sponsored by ServiceNow on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.